The merchant of death, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. Imagine for a second waking up on a beautiful Friday morning only to be greeted by your own obituary in the paper. Your name, your face, your entire life is summed up in a few cold paragraphs. But the shock of reading your own obituary is quickly overshadowed as your eyes scan the page. What you read isn't a somber tribute to your life. Rather, it's a twisted celebration of your death with a headline that spits on your legacy and brands you with a name you never asked for. The Merchant of Death. Now you have a choice. Die as the monster they say you are, or rewrite your ending. This is the story of Alfred Bernard Nobel, the creator of dynamite, an invention that brought unspeakable devastation to battlefields across the globe. A legacy he later tried to escape by creating the Nobel Prize, celebrating peace and scientific prowess.
Stockholm, Sweden, the scene of the annual award of Nobel Prizes for achievements in medicine, chemistry, physics, and literature.
Which brings up an important question. Was Alfred a man haunted by guilt, or simply a shrewd businessman rewriting his legacy? Alfred Bernard Nobel took his first breath on the 21st of October, 1833, in Stockholm, Sweden. He was one of 8 children of Emanuel and Andrietta Nobel. But out of these 8, only 4 survived early childhood since child mortality rates were fairly high in the early 19th century. His father, Emanuel Nobel, was an inventor and engineer, but he failed to realize his ambitions, resulting in his family sinking into bankruptcy just 3 months before Alfred's birth. For the next few years, Emanuel struggled to find a steady job and had to rely on loans to pay for necessities. However, after struggling to repay his loans, he found himself in serious trouble. In 1837, he was forced to flee from Sweden upon learning that his creditors planned to have him thrown into a debtor's prison. He made his way to Russia, chasing opportunities, while his family stayed in Sweden. In his absence, the Nobel family barely scraped by, with Alfred and his siblings often going to bed hungry. It was a rough time for Alfred, who spent most of his early childhood in absolute poverty. However, this struggle also marked the beginning of his lifelong obsession with chasing money. Fortunately, things took a turn for the better when Alfred turned 9 years old. Emanuel had found some success in Russia making wheel hubs for horse-drawn carriages. This allowed him to bring his family to Russia and give them the life he had always dreamed of. But things only got better from there, as Emanuel kept expanding his business into things like household radiators, and even invented a machine that drastically improved the production of plywood. This income from these different ventures was more than enough to give his sons private schooling. This was a huge win for Alfred in particular, as he had shown a keen interest in reading since he was just 3 years old. This passion persisted into teenage years, compelling him to visit Paris to study chemistry at a higher level. In 1850, Alfred Nobel set foot in Paris at the age of 17. A decision that would change the course of his life forever. While in Paris, Alfred met and studied under an Italian chemist by the name of Ascanio Sobrero. Ascanio was a brilliant chemist, renowned for his contributions across various fields of chemistry. However, during his time under Ascanio, Alfred fixated on a single chemical he had invented 3 years prior, called nitroglycerin. Now, for those who don't know, nitroglycerin is a colorless, oily liquid that's extremely explosive. Even a relatively small amount of this substance can produce a massive explosion. After seeing the destructive power of this chemical firsthand, Alfred came up with an idea to revolutionize the industrial mining industry. Unfortunately, luck was not in his favor at the time. And before he had the chance to fully figure out the capabilities of nitroglycerin, he was summoned back to Russia by his family. You see, while Alfred was studying chemistry abroad, his father Emanuel had branched out into weapons manufacturing. And through some of his business connections, he managed to get a meeting with the Emperor of Russia, Tsar Nicholas I. In this meeting, Emmanuel presented his idea for submerged explosive devices designed to remain hidden underwater and detonate upon contact with a ship. This was the birth of what we know as the naval mine. Nicholas immediately saw the potential and understood these explosives could be used to protect Russian waters. Then, in 1854, Russia went to war against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire in what we today call the Crimean War. And while horrible for the residents of these countries, this war was a golden opportunity for Emmanuel. As it turned out, the Black Sea was a key battlefront, and control over this battlefront could determine the outcome of the whole war. So, to strengthen their territory, the Russian government tasked Emmanuel Nobel with producing as many naval mines as possible. Put simply, the demand for his new invention was through the roof. He needed any help he could get, which is why he summoned Alfred back from Paris to help in the factory. Unfortunately, this demand came to a screeching halt in March of 1855 when Tsar Nicholas I became ill. He refused medical treatment and subsequently died of pneumonia. This greatly destabilized the Russian war effort, resulting in Russia making a call for peace and ending the war in 1856. By this point, Emmanuel had invested a significant amount of money into his mine manufacturing facilities, expecting to recoup the costs over the course of the war. However, this unexpected end tanked his business and once again brought him to the verge of bankruptcy. And just like last time, he tried to hold things together to the best of his abilities, but it wasn't enough. In 1859, he was forced to hand over his Russian assets to creditors and move back to Sweden with his wife and youngest sons, Alfred and Emil, while his eldest sons, Ludwig and Robert, stayed back in Russia to manage their father's former business for new owners. However, instead of viewing this as a setback, Alfred saw an opportunity. It was his chance to realize the idea he had conceived in Paris all those years ago. So after spending a few years settling back in Stockholm, Alfred created his first munitions factory in 1862. His goal was to finally find a way to use nitroglycerin for industrial demolition applications like mining and construction. At that time, the only reliable way to mine hard rock was with black powder, what we now know as gunpowder. However, gunpowder had a few significant drawbacks. It was unstable and dangerous, especially in the confined spaces of mines. The slightest spark or accidental ignition could lead to catastrophic explosions, putting workers' lives at constant risk. Additionally, gunpowder's power was limited. It often required large quantities to break through hard rock, making it wildly inefficient and costly. On top of that, it was also very sensitive to moisture, which made it unreliable in the wet conditions commonly found in mines. Better alternative was desperately needed, and Alfred Nobel was determined to provide it to the world. But if that were the case, why didn't he sell nitroglycerin directly? After all, it was a major step up from gunpowder in terms of firepower. However, that's where the good things about nitroglycerin end. Despite its superior power, it was dangerously unstable. It would react unpredictably to shock, temperature changes, and even slight vibrations, making it nearly impossible to transport. It felt like a vial of nitroglycerin could go off if you looked at it the wrong way. Its potential was undeniable, but in its raw form, it was more of a liability than a solution. Alfred understood these risks quite well. He knew that if he wanted to revolutionize industrial demolition, he needed to control nitroglycerin's destructive power without the constant risk of disaster. And even if the thought of selling raw nitroglycerin ever crossed his mind, it was quickly shattered by tragedy. In September of 1864, a nitroglycerin explosion at the Nobel factory killed his younger brother Emil, who was just 21 years old at the time. Shortly after learning of his youngest son's death, Emmanuel Nobel suffered a stroke. He never recovered. So for Alfred, this was no longer just business. It was personal. He had to find a way to control nitroglycerin's power, and that obsession led to one of the most groundbreaking discoveries in explosives history. In 1867, he finally made a breakthrough that would eventually change the world. One day, by complete accident, he discovered that mixing an absorbent material like diatomaceous earth, basically a mixture of fossilized algae, shells, and rocks, turned the unruly nitroglycerin into a much more tame powder. Amazingly, this powder retained nitroglycerin's explosive power but was far more stable. Alfred dubbed this new invention Dynamite, and he began selling it as packs of easy-to-use sticks under the name Nobel's Extra Dynamite. However, even he couldn't have predicted just how drastically this one invention would change the world. That said, things started off just as Alfred had hoped. He applied for and received patents from all major economies in the world, and dynamite quickly became the go-to explosive for demolition work around the world. It was powerful, easy to transport, and simple to use. Everything miners had been waiting for. However, it didn't take long for dynamite to attract an unexpected customer: the military. Everything that made it good for demolition also made it the perfect material for warfare. Militaries from around the world started purchasing dynamite by the boatloads to power landmines, torpedoes, and even some experimental dynamite guns. Dynamite became a staple of war. In the meantime, his older brothers, who were still in Russia, partnered with him to create the Nobel Oil Company. Alfred's dynamite played a massive role in the expansion of this company, helping them blast away entire mountainsides to create efficient railroad networks, and within a few years, Nobel became one of the largest oil producers in the entire world, resulting in the three brothers becoming filthy rich. In all likelihood, Alfred probably never expected things to unfold this way, but now that they had, he went all in. Started using money from dynamite sales and his oil fortune to create armament factories anywhere he could. It wasn't long before Alfred was single-handedly the biggest creator of war products on the planet. However, nearly 2 decades later, he received a reality check that made him rethink his entire life. This brings us back to the story we talked about in the very beginning. You see, on the 12th of April, 1888, Alfred's brother Ludwig passed away. When news of his brother's death broke, some newspapers mistakenly thought Alfred had died instead. They published his obituary, a copy of which found its way into his hands. Now, unfortunately, the original publication has since been lost to time, but from what we know, its title stated La Marchande de la Morte Mort, which translates to The Merchant of Death is Dead. It also included a segment which read, Dr. Alfred Nobel, who became rich by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before, died yesterday. As the story goes, this deeply disturbed Alfred and made him reevaluate the purpose of his life. For perhaps the first time, he saw himself through the world's eyes as a monster. This incident also inspired a change of heart that became apparent after his death on December 10, 1896. He never married or had children, leaving his inheritance an open question. But when his will became public, it wasn't something anyone could have predicted. His will ordered that 94% of his fortune be liquidated, which was about $200 million in today's money, to create a charitable foundation. This foundation would grant annual awards to those, in his words, shall have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind, for categories including physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. This award later became known as the Nobel Prize, a title that was given to some of the greatest minds in history like Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. Most importantly, this award has completely rewritten Alfred Nobel's legacy. Today, most people know him as the founder of the Nobel Prize, with little awareness of his past reputation as a greedy warmonger. Looking back, Alfred's story mirrors that of another brilliant mind who used his genius for mass destruction, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the so-called father of the atomic bomb. Like Oppenheimer, Nobel's innovations reshaped warfare as he spearheaded the development of powerful explosives that changed the battlefield forever. But there is one substantial difference between the two. Put simply, Oppenheimer did what he did for his country. Alfred, on the other hand, did everything for money. Which brings up the most important question about Alfred Nobel. Did he create the Nobel Foundation out of guilt after reading his own obituary? Or was he simply a shrewd businessman looking to rewrite his own legacy? His story proves that it's never too late to change, even after death. And while his past may be complicated, the impact of his foundation is undeniable. However, there's also evidence suggesting this could have been a carefully calculated move to erase his dark past from history. For instance, he still owned and operated 90 armament factories at the time of his death. If he really cared about peace, why didn't he shut any of them in the 8 years between reading his obituary and his death? Unfortunately, we'll never know for sure. That said, even if his intentions were pure, doesn't using his war money to fund peace bring up the idea of sports washing? Which is when countries or individuals use sports sponsorships or events to improve a tarnished reputation, often to distract from unethical actions or controversial histories. If the distributors of Oxycontin, responsible for fueling widespread addiction, launched a prize for breakthroughs in health or similar fields, should the winners accept this prize? In other words, should a good initiative be allowed to stand apart from its shady origins? Or are they forever intertwined? Let us know in the comments below.